This is my iPhone, and I use this iPhone for all sorts of wonderful things. I use it to time 3 minutes so that I don't shortchange you or I don't fall asleep, and I'll get to that in a second. I also use it to find you. So if I say I'm coming for a visit, likely I've pulled out this thing, I've typed in an address, and I find you with the directions in this phone. And I also input all sorts of great and wonderful things into my phone. I do play games on it. But anyways, probably didn't need to say that. So I also input all sorts of interesting things in this phone. I put in contact information. So if you tell me your phone number, I am likely to put it in my phone. And I put in my calendar, because otherwise I would forget that I'm supposed to come visit you, or I would forget that I have Frisbee or a date night. Actually, I never forget those things. So I use this phone for all sorts of important things. I also write lists in it. Deep inside this phone is a factory reset button. If I were to dig in my settings, I would find a screen that would say, "Do you want to erase everything on your phone?" I'm not even going to get close to that screen now. That's why we have this. We could reset this phone right back to the way it came out of the box. Reset my phone. I want to ask a bigger question today, though. What if we had a reset button for some other things in this world? Like, let's suppose that somewhere in the world there was a red button that said, "This button resets the banking system." And with one simple push of this button, it would reset everything. Now, there would likely be two responses to this. There would be some people who have mortgages and credit cards and lines of credit stretched to the end, and they would go to the bank and they wouldn't owe any more money. And they would say, "Hallelujah!" And then there's another side of it, right? There are some people who have money in a pension fund, who have accumulated a little bit for a rainy day, and they would go to the bank to take out a little bit of money, and their reaction would be exactly the opposite. I'm not even allowed to say those words in church. Okay. Or what if we had a reset button for land ownership? If somewhere in the world there was a big red button that said, "This resets all the ownership of the land in the world," what would happen if we were to press that button? Or what if we did that for wealth at large? We took everybody's wealth and we put it into a pot, we pressed reset, and we distributed it differently. What would that do? We'll stick with this idea of a factory reset button for most of this sermon. Let's go to Genesis 1 for a second. You all know this story, this creation myth. 6 days God works. God creates light and dark and animals and people and land and water, and on the seventh day, God does nothing. And God does nothing as an example for us to rest. And then it's written into the commandments. It's the only commandment that says, "Remember the Sabbath and keep it," quote, "holy." So here we have this example. Take one of every 7 days and take it off. Take a break. Now, the Sabbath day is the thing that we know most. But also written into those laws were Sabbath years. every 7 years, you would not till the land. So for 6 years, you would work the land, you would eat off the land, but on the 7th year, you give the land a rest. We don't really talk about Sabbath years very much. And then there's this even more remarkable idea. It's the year of Jubilee. Take 7 Sabbath years, so 7 times 7, you get 49, and on the 50th, what do? You have a year of Jubilee. And the year of Jubilee is marked by 2 specific ideas, both quite related. Suppose you are a landowner, which many people needed to be. You needed to be a landowner because a landowner meant that you could live off the land. You could grow enough food and vegetables and animals to make a living for yourself. But there might come a time when things got rough. You might have a bad year, a drought, a stampede, and you would lose whatever was on your land. And to help get you through, you might sell a chunk of your land. And if you had enough bad years and enough bad things happened, you might find yourself without land. And when you don't have land, it's hard to live. And the year of Jubilee was marked by this extraordinary law. Everyone goes home to their own land. Debts are forgiven. So, if you lost your land, on the Sabbath year, you would get it back. So if you lost your land in year 10, you'd have to wait 40 years to get it back. If you lost your land in year 48, you only have to get it back in 2 years. It's like a factory reset button. Now, let's suppose you lose all your land. What do you have left? Well, you have your time and your energy, and so you give that to somebody. You contract yourself out, sometimes even to the point of servitude. And the year of Jubilee says, anyone who's in your service, they are free to go. It's remarkable. Not only are you free to go, but your land will be there waiting for you. That's amazing. Now, what is this year of Jubilee intended to do? It's to break cycles like this. On one side, a wealthy family says, here are the riches they have been given to you that have been acquired through the generations. And the opposite is said to the family on the other side. Because we know these things happen in long, drawn-out cycles. But the year of Jubilee, being countercultural, breaks this cycle. Are we tracking? So there's this great leveling every 50 years. Everything goes back. We've been using this graph, or at least last week we used this graph, to talk about these cycles from empire to exile. And these continually happen. Exile and empire. This wave that seems to happen. Well, the year of Jubilee stops something like this from happening because every so often, everything is redistributed. We've also been using this image, an image of ruin. The writer of Isaiah is writing to people in the ruins. And he's writing to people in the ruins who are in desperate need of some hope and desperate need of some comfort. And why have they found themselves there? because they haven't managed to have a year of Jubilee. Like, have we ever had a year of Jubilee? I can actually imagine the conversation. At the beginning of the year of Jubilee, there's supposed to be a trumpet that is sounded to mark the beginning of the year. And yet I can imagine the people who have lost their land and are in servitude, I can imagine them waiting, like, when's the trumpet going to sound? And I can imagine all the people who have lots of wealth sitting in another room going, do you want to blow the trumpet? I don't really want to blow the trumpet. I don't want to give up the land I've worked so hard for. So we've never had a year of Jubilee. A few years back, I believe, we also had a whole campaign around Jubilee, right? We said, as a developed nation who has lent a lot of money to developing nations, let us clear the debt. And these debts were actually quite small, right? A country like Nicaragua might only have $5 or $10 billion, and they would have paid that debt many times over in interest, and yet we couldn't bring ourselves to forgive those debts. Jubilees, hard to come by. And yet, into the ruins, Isaiah speaks. Just as an aside, joy to the world. We listen to that on bells. Imagine if that same song was played in the ruins. Somebody rolls up a piano into the middle of the ruined streets, and they bring the old church bells down, and they begin playing this very subtle yet very beautiful joy to the world. Imagine the images of hope that would rise up. That is the nature of Isaiah. Now, this reset button idea, this year of Jubilee, becomes very relevant in Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty for the captives and release of the prisoners, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Isaiah is saying, in the middle of the ruins, year of Jubilee is going to come. Has it arrived yet? No. But his prophecy is that it will come. Isaiah spends a lot of time expounding on this idea. One of the images that he uses is in verse 5. Start reading about halfway down. Strangers shall stand and feed your flocks, and foreigners shall till your land and dress your vines. Now, at first sight, this appears like we're creating another empire. We're going to have people, they're going to come in, they're going to do all the work for us. But what if it's speaking of something else? Suppose that I told you today, there is a land where every 50 years, they press the reset button on everything. Would you want to go be a part of that? The image says yes, that people will come, they'll leave their homeland, they'll want to be a stranger in another land because it will be so magnificent. The last part of Isaiah also speaks to the first part of Isaiah. There's this cryptic nature to Isaiah. I will greatly rejoice in the Lord. My whole being shall exult in my God, for he has clothed me with the garments of salvation. Now, is Isaiah talking about himself here? If he is, he's quite confident, shall we say, maybe even arrogant. Or is he talking about something yet to come? If we look back at verses 1 to 2, it also speaks of this anointed one waiting for something. And these words in Isaiah 61, 1 and 2 were words that people uttered to themselves many, many times. For God has anointed me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim the release of prisoners, to proclaim the year of God's favor. In the book of Luke, a man walks into a synagogue. He takes a scroll and he unrolls it. And he finds Isaiah 61, 1 and 2. And he reads these verses in front of the people gathered in the synagogue. For God has anointed me to come to proclaim freedom from the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, provide release for the captives. Then he rolls up the scroll, he turns around, and he says to them all, "Today, in your hearing, this is fulfilled." Not sometime in the past, not sometime in the future, but right here, right now, this is fulfilled. So we wait for that day. We are in Advent, and so we wait some more. We wait to hear those words again, and we long to utter them ourselves as well.